So Brian has come to present on community engagement, and Brian is an associate professor of kinesiology at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis. He has been involved in out-of-school time program initiatives with PHE Canada and was a visiting Fulbright Scholar to Concordia University in 2014, researching social justice and infrastructures for physical activity. So Brian's going to speak a little bit more about how you can use community engagement to strengthen programs that you're doing with We Belong and in the future as well. So Brian, I gave you control, so you should be able to switch, but let me know if you're having problems and I can do it from here.
Very good.
Okay.
Let's see.
Perfect.
All right. Well, I think the screen, there we go. Well, thank you for, again, for having me come and talk to you today. I've been involved with this program since the inception, and I think it's a very exciting time for this type of activity. Briefly today, what we're going to do is go over a few things. First of all, the welcome, and we've already taken care of that. I'm going to discuss how we sometimes can take physical activity for granted. We'll go to what is community engagement and why do we engage in it and why is it an important piece to this particular program. We're going to talk about conceptualizing community. I will talk about recent trends, characteristics involving families and groups towards the future, and wrap up in questions. Am I still being able to be heard? I'm still good? Public does a lot of, and this is one example that I've kind of come up with the past few months in talking about taking physical activity for granted in terms of beach ball politics. Now, a lot of us may look at a beach ball. In fact, a lot of us look at that right now, given the fact that it's pretty cold in North America right now, just about every part. And we're saying to ourselves, what does a beach ball have to do with physical activity and people taking it for granted? One of the things that we kind of keep in mind as far as this example, a beach ball is sort of an object that most of us can relate to. It's a relatively inexpensive thing. Most of us have experienced hitting a beach ball in a recreational format or seen one being hit among a group of people. But we understand this. When we have a small group of people and we're hitting that beach ball, we have a better opportunity to participate. There's a feeling of accomplishment typically when we strike that ball, and if it makes us feel good, we want to hit the ball more. So one thing to think about in terms of that model, this example, that mix, then they're not getting enough hits as well. Eventually, if we decide to add on more people without stopping this activity, it's going to lead to a level of frustration for some people. Typically, when you do this beach ball activity, and some of you have done this before, you've been teachers and been involved in recreation, you find a few people that start hitting the ball because they have knowledge and a way of communicating strategy. And then you have others who get left out because they can't change the task. And then you get those who end up leaving because how fun is it to be in a game with 40 other people and you're not hitting the ball? Eventually you're going to leave that activity. So that's something to kind of think about in terms of framing this whole discussion today, is that we have the opportunity to look at that ball in terms of getting resources to people. So we have to, for lack of a better term, find more particular beach balls to spread out to people so that they can have opportunities to participate in physical activity in our communities. So in this, we think about the types of community challenges that we have. The first one is obesity. The second one is something related to diabetes, sedentary lifestyle and behaviors is something as well. Heart disease is another issue. Access to physical activity. I think I skipped ahead one. It's coming back to you. Affordable opportunities for people to be able to participate in physical activity. Equitable opportunities for people to be able to participate in physical activity and health-related pieces. One thing that we deal with here in the United States is something called food and exercise deserts. And for some of y'all who may not have an idea of what that is, it's basically situations to where in your poor communities you don't have access to appropriate food. When I'm saying appropriate, nutritious food, and you don't have access to exercise facilities. Another issue is engagement for youth and senior populations, neighborhood history, university history, because we historically have tried to do physical activity programs through universities, but as I'll allude to later, part of the problem with that is that universities sometimes can tend to come in, do a program, and then they leave. And then last but not least is the focus for what we're going to talk about today, which is engagements for new persons coming into a community. So our question is, as we've finally gotten this screen figured out, what is community engagement and why do we participate in it? Community engagement, very simple piece. Fawcett came out in 1995, describes community engagement as the process of working collaboratively with and through groups of people affiliated by geographic proximity, special interest, or similar situations to address issues affecting the well-being of those people. It is used as a powerful vehicle for bringing about environmental and behavioral changes that will improve the health of the community and its members. It often involves partnerships and coalitions, much like what we're involved with today, that help mobilize resources and influence systems, change relationships among partners, and serve as catalysts for changing policies, programs, and practices. When we use community engagement in practice, it blends social science and art. This science can come from areas such as cultural anthropology, organizational psychology, with organizing concepts from literature on community participation. It also has things related to building constituencies. It also has things related to community psychology, the understanding of cultural groups and other sources that may be applicable to this. Over the past 2 decades, community engagement has been discussed with evidence, and we're talking about just empirical evidence, research-based things, being found that supports the notion that the social environment in which people live, along with their lifestyle and behaviors, can influence physical activity and health outcomes in a population. Recently, it's been demonstrated that populations can gain long-term health improvements when people become involved in their community and work together to affect change. This is different than what has been historically implemented in years past. So as I alluded to before, people that don't really have a tie-in to the community deciding to involve themselves in the community matters. And sometimes this can be, as I said before, universities. Sometimes this can be politicians, although they mean well. Sometimes they don't necessarily have the best interests of groups in heart. And the only goal that these people some have had in the past is to collect data or gain a political advantage. So community engagement by individuals helps us benefit our communities because it contributes to what's called social capital. The concept of social capital refers to relationships and structures within the community that promote cooperation for mutual benefit. Social capital is observed in healthy communities where high levels of leadership, skills, networks, psychological attachment to the community, and the understanding of the community's history, along with what we consider as people who work in the community, something called critical reflection. We're all involved in the We Belong initiative because we want to make our communities better. I hope we're all aware that what we're doing right now is a transformational experience for a lot of different reasons, not only for us, but for the people that we're going to touch. And also, the biggest issue about being involved in the community is that sometimes people get frustrated about change, and one thing we need to understand is that these things take a while to be realized. Another definition that we have is to this definition of how to conceptualize community. So what is it? As we see our graphic here, community can look at and entail a lot of different aspects. We become members of a community by choice, typically. It's a voluntary piece, or a part of a community by personal characteristics such as age, gender, race, ethnicity, or physical ability. Since each of us can be part of multiple communities, we must be aware that while there may be similarities among a group, for instance, there are complex associations that can be involved with groups. So the question here is, what are the recent trends that we're working with? As I've alluded to before, some of what I've been doing the past few years is looking at different populations, immigrant populations in North America. And in Canada, here's some recent trends of note. First of all, most recent immigrants to Canada comment that the lack of social relationships and interactions was one of the greatest challenges that they have since arriving in the country. Typically more than things such as housing discrimination, access to education, or access to professional services and child care. So here's some statistics for you. First of all, 1 in 5 now in Canada is foreign-born, the highest proportion among G8 countries. Canada has roughly about 200 ethnic groups and 100 religions. 60% of foreign-born Canadians come from Asia and the Middle East. About 6.3 million people, or 19% of Canada's population, and keep in mind that this research was done probably about 2 or 3 years ago, so that's increased a little bit, count themselves as a member of a visible minority group. In 2011, Canada had a foreign-born population of 6.8 million people, or about 20% of the total population. So when we look at these particular recent trends, we see that there are some particular things that we need to focus on with groups of people. We also know that immigrants are often marginalized as a group as they attempt to assimilate into society. Unfortunately, marginalized populations have poor health outcomes and are impacted by other social and economic barriers such as poverty, social exclusion, job security, and level of education. These are important aspects to a person's health status. Obviously, we know when there's no income, there are few opportunities to be engaged in physical activities that can improve health outcomes. Here are some characteristics of things that we find that have been successful community engagement efforts. First of all, we'll take environmental. Environmental, in order for those things to be successful, you have to have a history of collaboration or cooperation in the community. What I like about this particular program and why I was so excited about being involved with it is because, just think about it this way. We are at the ground level of pushing collaboration and cooperation in the community. I think I heard in the background before we started that we have one person that's actually starting their soccer program today. I mean, when you think about the gravity of that, I mean, you know, there may or may not have been a history of soccer in that particular community, but relevant to this We Belong program and the focus, that's a first-time thing, and that has the potential to be very transformational for people. Also, when we talk about environmental, we discuss collaborating group and agencies and groups seen as people who are leaders in the community. And also, there's typically a history of a favorable political and social climate. The second one, membership. Typically when we talk about characteristics of successful things in terms of that, we think of mutual respect, understanding, and trust. We think about appropriate cross-selection of members. We think about members seeing engagement in their self-interest or benefits of engagement as offsetting costs. And most importantly, with membership, an ability to compromise. With process and structure, members feel some type of ownership. information and discussion are characteristics of communication, and also informal and formal channels of communication. What's the purpose? The purpose typically refers to goals clear and realistic to everyone that's involved, a shared vision, and unique to the effort from goals, mission statements, or other approaches from other members. Last but not least, when we talk about characteristics of successful community engagement, we want to make sure that we have sufficient funds, and sometimes these are things that we can gain over a period of time. And then we also want to make sure we have skilled people to be able to take those funds and use them appropriately. So what I was asked to do is provide some examples of some success stories here. And many of you may be somewhat familiar with this, so I apologize if this is sort of old hat, so to speak. But this is a success story from the Canadian Park and Recreational Association. In 2005, so roughly, obviously 10 years ago, what the Canadian Park and Recreation Association decided to do was conduct the needs assessment of recreational practitioners and non-governmental organizations working with 5 target groups. Those 5 target groups were immigrant groups, and what they wanted to do was determine barriers that they face in engaging these groups. They wanted to see what resources and training existed to support their efforts, and they also wanted to identify successful engagement strategies. So what they first did was do a needs assessment. They did research, and they decided that but they found a few of these things, commonalities among the 5 target groups, specifically in the city of Hamilton, Ontario, and that's one of the examples that I thought would be very appropriate to look at and discuss later. They found that 25% of Hamilton's population were from immigrants or foreign-born communities. A few years previously, in 2002, the city of Hamilton initiated a formal community-wide process to enhance safety, acceptance, and harmony among all residents of the city. There was some concerns about issues related to racism and other violence directed toward immigrant populations who were just coming to the city. Another thing that they found was mainstream recreational services were not meeting the needs of children and youth from Hamilton's diverse communities. Unfortunately, this is a trend that's rising in North America, and we have this issue in the United States as well. They found also that representatives of immigrant communities did not express a desire for sports played in their home countries to be offered. So, for instance, if you were from India, the assumption would be is that, okay, since cricket is big in India, well, let's offer cricket here. Well, they ended up finding out that, at least for the groups that they studied, that that wasn't necessarily the case. They wanted to see things and participate in activities like basketball and soccer, and they found that those were identified frequently for improving access for new immigrant populations. In creating the program, they found a couple key initiatives. First was fee waivers and allocation of staff time was a big deal. Second, soccer for young adults. They did eventually build a new cricket pitch, but it was a multi-use facility. And they wanted to have drop-in programs and have hockey activities for girls as well. Some other things, staff training, which is a very important piece to what they did. They had a mandatory 2-day anti-racism session for the department's supervisors, coordinators, and managers with appropriate follow-up. And just as an aside, I think sometimes when we talk about diversity-related initiatives, it can turn into a situation where it focuses on one particular ethnic group. And as I would always caution and advise to groups who are trying to do diversity, first of all, it shouldn't just be targeted over the course of just one day at stop. It should be something that's assessed over the course of a year. Last but not least, as far as creating a program, they created a Youth Ambassador Soccer program for immigrant and inner city youth called the Hamilton Young Ambassador Soccer Program. It had absolutely no cost to youth, and it went from ages from 10 to 19. So that's pretty much the beginning of that particular success story. And now the question was, for this group, after they researched this, is what did they learn? Here were some few things. First of all, things that were contributing to the success were first, community engagement and reaching out. Second, networking in the community. Third, assessing provincial government and other funding for special initiatives. Another thing was taking advantage of the popularity of soccer and basketball programs. Starting from strength was another issue, or another thing that they were found, from the initial pilot projects, groups tended to be ones that had been in existence longer, were better organized, and had better leaders and volunteers. Another factor of success was providing instructors who speak other languages. And still another was using informal contacts to build relationships with immigrant groups. Again, these factors of success are things that if you look at our We Belong program guide and things that we've discussed over the course of a few months, these are things that are very similar to what we're trying to do with this program. Challenges to some of the programming. Capacity of new immigrant groups. For instance, some immigrant organizations, especially the new ones who have just come into the country, were not very well organized and their capacity to operate programs is low. And when we talk about capacity, that means funding. Okay? Second was resistance to change. There was some resistance to change in the way that programs had operated historically and how access to facilities was determined. Another challenge that was found was there was a high demand for facilities at peak times. Again, that's an issue that's pretty common to what we found here in the United States as well. So if you can imagine using, for instance, a school after school time. So if you wanted to go in and use the gymnasium from the hours of 3 to 6 p.m., what may happen a lot of times is that coaches find that they wanted to use that. So new community groups competing with established groups for use of facilities. Another challenge was how to decide which groups to approach and to fund. Some barriers that they looked at and considered was lack of information about certain groups, particularly Muslim women, and also a lack of information, money, and discrimination as far as programming was based on race and language with Spanish-speaking women. So the takeaway, here's what they found. First of all, needing leadership at the top and trying to engage more elected officials to overcome some of this resistance to change. They found that immigrant groups needed support from the municipality. They found that the need for community development approach to specific immigrant populations and not just lumping everyone into one group. Starting projects with organizations that had volunteers was found as something that was huge. Focus on building stable long-term relationships was another takeaway lesson. Inviting groups to use facilities at different times so that they become familiar with the facilities was found as a takeaway piece. Working with people who are champions, and this is very important. Because a lot of times I think if we're not members of a group, we feel that we can always speak for the needs of that population. Every group has a champion, and it's up to us to try to find out who that person is so we can work with that person in order to help groups. Finally, they found that drop-in activities for youth worked well. They found that formal consultation processes could often produce misleading results. And also they found that they wanted to keep lessons relatively low. Now, we've talked a little bit about characteristics of successful community engagement efforts. So I'm not going to go into a huge detail about this before, but just as a reminder, when we look at all those things in total, remember what we talked about as far as environmental. So this history of collaboration, this collaborating group and agency, and this favorable political and social climate. Again, the mutual respect in this particular example and trust, an appropriate cross-section of members, people seeing themselves of persons that they had a vested self-interest in what was going on, and also this ability to compromise. persons feeling ownership in the process, individuals having the situation to participate in decision making, people having flexibility of collaborating groups, clarity of role and guidelines, and again, the sustainability of the particular pieces. Communication, open and frequent interaction and discussion, and formal and informal channels as well. A purpose, remember, goals that had something to have for the different partners, a shared vision, and those things that were unique to an effort in the organization. And finally, resources. Now, we ask ourselves now, how to involve families and groups? That's a huge piece to kind of this whole scenario of what we try to do. So some of the benefits for adults, obviously community connections. Adults can have we found that adults should have these type of programs in order to help create social support networks, which is a big piece. Obviously, a lower stress and better well-being by creating these social support networks and community connections. And these benefits will increase their energy and vitality. And actually, one of the things that wasn't mentioned on there is this idea of self-esteem and self-efficacy, which is the ability to feel like they actually belong to the community and the ability to feel like they can do tasks. For our youth in these particular types of programs, first of all, concentration and learning. As we've seen a litany of research in the past decade and a half that's talked about physical activity and health being a great tie-in to academic performance in the classroom. Now think about this. So we have physical education in schools, and we have a situation to where we have physical activity and sport, recreation, and health teaching in the afternoon. It does nothing but be a benefit in these types of situations. Leadership, self-discipline and commitment, communication and cooperation skills, reduce boredom and antisocial behavior. And one thing that's not mentioned on here, and this is a situation we work with in the United States often, is community violence. I often wonder, we talk about the rise in community violence in North America, and I sometimes wonder if part of the reason why we have these increases in violence is because we don't have anything to occupy students' time with. Towards the future. So one of the things that we can ask ourselves as we end up here in the next few minutes is, what is the reality that we want to create for our communities? So often we spend so much time during the day and we just do tasks, but we never think about our communities and how they're going to be left to new people who are going to be coming in that will be continuing our legacy. So here's some things to think about. And this is something I wrote an article about a few years ago in terms of looking at different populations. Do we consider, first of all, security and shelter? Or perhaps we should consider it when we make sure we enforce our programs. Basic functions. At the first level, are these programs that we create safe? Second, do they have social contact? So are people involved in these programs having appropriate and targeted interactions that are positive? Third, symbolic identification. When we post things, and many of you will be in situations where you use symbolism, or you are in a gym and you put up posters or something to that effect, what do they mean? Does it look like some of the groups that are actually being involved in the program? And if it doesn't, how can we create that type of atmosphere? Just as an example, in gymnasiums, most people never notice the fact that sometimes in our secondary school gymnasiums, we will look at, when we go into the gymnasium, typically you have trophies. And that's the only thing that's posted. But if these gymnasiums, are often used as physical education classrooms, and there's nothing to speak to the person who participates just in physical activity. So that's just something to think about. As we're doing our programs, perhaps we want to take our own pictures and use examples of people participating in our programs to help spur other folks. Another piece, pleasure. So is this an enjoyable type of situation for people? Task instrumentality. Does their physical environment let people succeed? And then, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, growth. What type of cognitive and lasting benefits will be a part of this program? And 3 questions that I didn't write on here that I typically have people ask is, first of all, when you come to a new place, can this place be mine or adjusted to me? Can I produce results here? And can I relate to and get along with others here?